I'm Michael. I'm in R2. I'm involved in RDC as well.
Michael, I can't hear you.
Oh, let's see.
I do see you're unmuted though, so I'm not sure.
Nina, it may be just you.
Oh.
We can hear.
It's me.
Sweet.
Sorry.
Great. No worries. I was like, oh, I don't know how to troubleshoot this. Okay. Alrighty. So yeah, I am an R2. I'm in the health equity pathway. And I, as I'm sure many of you, often spend time thinking about how to make our institutions better in the future, more equitable for our patients and for us as residents. Shout out RFPU. But part of that also makes me think of our past, how we got to where we are. And so I thought it would be fun for my talk to do a little bit of digging on the history of our city and our hospitals, a social history, if you will. So this is a picture of Harborview Hall in 1931. Shortly after this building, Harborview Hospital rather, shortly after it was finished construction. And if it looks familiar, it's because now that building is a center tower of a much larger Harborview Medical Center. There's going to be a lot of me talking during this presentation. I couldn't think of that many creative ways to break things up. So please stop to share questions, comments, or other fun history facts if you have them. Also in advance, sometimes when I talk, my cats like to talk back, so apologies if they make a cameo. Before I talk more about the hospitals we work in, I wanted to step back and talk about the land that we're all zooming from and living on. We are here in the Pacific Northwest coast, which is home and has been for the past 12,000 years to the Coast Salish peoples. The Coast Salish refers to a family language, a language of families rather, of over 24 distinct dialects and languages. And the interrelated but distinct groups of people that spoke these languages. Here in the Puget Sound, most tribes speak the Chute Seed. And this map you're looking at comes from Native Land Digital, which is a Canadian-based Indigenous-led organization that works along with community contributions to try and map out the traditional homelands of Indigenous people across the globe. If you look at our map, you'll see some tribal names which you may recognize. The Suquamish, the Muckleshoot, and Duwamish are some that are close by. The Suquamish tribe is across the sound from us on Kitsap Peninsula. Those are up there, my cats. And the Muckleshoot is further south of us in Auburn. And both of these are amongst the 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington state. Unfortunately, the Duwamish tribe, whose homelands overlay all of present-day Seattle, are not federally recognized. So I wanted to take some time to talk about Duwamish history because their history is also our history. And our city of Seattle is actually named after one of their chiefs, Chief Sealth, who was chief of both the Duwamish groups and the Suquamish tribes at the time that European settlers first arrived in the 1850s. In 1851, European American settlers first touched down at Alki Point, spent a tough winter there, and then decided to hop across Elliott Bay to what is now known as Pioneer Square. A lot of the big road names in Seattle are actually the last names of some of these founders of Seattle. So like Yesler, Denny, Boren, Miner, they're all kind of white men that came to Seattle in the 1850s. One of these, Doc Maynard, was actually a doctor. And he was known to be a relative to that time, supporter of friendly relations with Indigenous people, and actually befriended Chief Sealth. And he was sort of integral in some of the early talks between the Native chiefs and the Washington Territory. In 1853, the Washington Territory was created, carved out of the then existing Oregon Territory, and a man named Isaac Stevens is made the governor. And then he gets around trying to meet with Native tribes, but often with force and intimidation, getting them to sign a series of treaties, which eventually cedes most of their homelands over to the Washington Territory. The one more relevant to us is the Treaty of Point Elliott, which was signed in 1855. Leaders from about 20 different tribes signed the treaty, and You can see Isaac Stevens' signature is the first, and then Chief Seattle's is right under his as leader of both the Duwamish and the Squamish tribes. And effectively, that treaty ceded 54,000 acres of land, which now comprise almost most of King County, including the cities of Seattle, Renton, Bellevue, over to the Washington Territory. I think it's important to note that European concepts of land ownership and property rights were like completely incomprehensible to the indigenous peoples of America, who had a very different relationship to the land. And, you know, so for them also, their relationship to their land was very sacred, and it was very important to them that they remain on it and close to their ancestral homeland. What they got in return for ceding over this land was, you know, fishing and hunting rights in perpetuity, and also the creation of reservations, pockets of land where they could relocate to. And those were the terms of the treaty. Now, over the next 10 years, there was a lot of battles and fighting between various native tribes and the European settlers that just continued and continued to arrive. Many aspects of the treaty were not met, and also as settlers arrived and crowded out or were just xenophobic and to native tribes, they realized they couldn't do the fishing that they wanted. And by 1866, there had been reservations created for the Squamish and the Muckleshoot tribes, which are where they are currently today, but none had been made for the Duwamish. So an US Indian Bureau agent wrote to the government to say, like, hey, it's about time we fulfill the terms of our treaty. Let's make a reservation for the Duwamish people in Seattle. But the residents of the city protested, here's a snippet, calling it a great injustice to them, uncalled for and of little value to the Indians, and that it was completely unnecessary because their band numbered but 16 families. Their protest was successful, and no reservation was made for the Duwamish people, who continue to this day do not have a reservation, which has also hindered them in their journey to get federally recognized. In the 1970s, they officially petitioned for federal recognition. Over 20 years later, in the last days of the Clinton administration, their petition was approved, but the Bush administration took over 2 days later and overturned that decision. And in 2013, a federal judge ruled that the Bush administration had denied recognition based on outdated rules and reopened the case for the Duwamish. But again, in 2015, they were denied, this time based on, quote, insufficient evidence that the tribe as a distinct community has existed on a substantial basis since 1900. The Duwamish has appealed this decision, and to this day, it is under active review, awaiting a decision on their federal recognition. They are very much still here. This is a picture of Cecile Hansen, who is, has been the chair of the tribal council since 1975. She is the great-great-grandniece of Chief Seagull. Under her leadership in the 90s, the Duwamish, you know, still not being federally recognized and not having their own land, decided to purchase an acre of land in West Seattle, near one of their ancestral villages. And over the next 10 years, built a longhouse and cultural center, which is open. This is the first longhouse to be on the ground, you know, the grounds of Seattle in over 115 years. In the 1850s, there were at least 93 known Duwamish and other tribal longhouses scattered throughout the waterways of the Puget Sound. But between the 1850s and 1900, these were all burned down or destroyed, or by fire or others, by settlers. Finally, as land acknowledgements become more common in talks and conferences, I wanted to highlight some recent sentiments that, you know, we should take care to make sure the land acknowledgements are done with intention and not just some token gesture. If anything I've said so far makes you uncomfortable, upset, or just feel some type of way, I think that's a place to reflect upon. You know, I think we have all benefited from settler colonialism, and it's our own kind of task to sit with that and figure out what we want to do about it. So I invite you all to take some time after this to deepen your understanding of the land and the native peoples that have lived here and continue to live here. And if you can, support them with monetary donation or your time. Easy way to do that is by going to the Duwamish Tribe's website. If you take a visit, there are things you can do like sign a petition or participate in letter writing for their federal recognition. One of their initiatives is called Real Rent Duwamish, where you can make donations to the tribe. The only time the Duwamish tribe has been paid for their land is in 1971, when the US government, as part of the settlement, paid 1,000 members of the tribe a handsome $64 each, for a grand total of $64,000, which in 2022 money is $440,000, which in the 2020 housing market could maybe buy you like a very small one-bedroom apartment. So do consider if you're able to make some donations. You can also check out their longhouse, which is open, or support one of the other tribes in the region, as I mentioned earlier. Another org I wanted to bring your attention to is the Chief Seattle Club, which is based in Pioneer Square. They are a housing and human services agency, specifically dealing with Native peoples experiencing homelessness. And Native American and Alaska Natives experience homelessness at a much higher rate than other peoples. Here is a graph from the 2020 Count Us In, which is the Seattle King County point in time count of people experiencing homelessness. We do this every year, but in 2020 we didn't due to COVID. 2021 we didn't due to COVID. But if you look at this chart, in green it just represents the proportion of Seattle County residents that group makes up in total, and then the other bars are by year, the proportion of people experiencing homelessness. So you'll see that for American Indian and Alaska Natives, there are only 1% of our population that make up 15% of our population experiencing homelessness, which is a huge disparity. I also wanted to point attention to other groups that are disproportionately affected, which are the Black residents in Seattle, which only make up 7% of the population, but 25% of the homeless population, as well as the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, who you'll see every year are making up a large proportion of our unhoused people. So the Chief Seattle Club has recently opened a building and community center called All, which still is Shutsi, the word for home. It contains over 80 units of affordable housing, and it's opening up this year, so that's really exciting. I will take this moment to take a pause and see if anyone has any thoughts, questions, comments. Alrighty. So let's go back to Talk Maynard and to Seattle in the 1850s. As a reminder, Washington Territory was fairly new at this time, but this will eventually get us back to Harborview and its mission. So in 1854, the Washington Territory Legislature passes a law, Act Relating to the Support of the Poor, which mandates that each county be responsible for caring for the population that couldn't care for themselves, whether they were living in poverty, had disability, or were sick. Initially, private citizens were sort of asked to handle this, take care of their family members that couldn't take care of themselves, et cetera. But oftentimes the county had to appoint people to carry over this task and then pay them a contract to do it. Initially, private citizens would help as they could. So Doc Maynard in 1863 opened Seattle's first charity hospital. There was only a 2-room hospital in what is now Pioneer Square. At that time, that district was literally called the Maynardtown District. And he and his wife took care of patients there, delivering babies, setting bones, managing infections, etc., until he passed in 1873. He was also one of few providers that provided care to both settlers and indigenous people. But the private citizen thing wasn't working out. So in 1877, King County had to look for someone else to kind of take over this duty. They had inherited this farmland some years ago with a farmhouse on it and decided to turn that farmhouse into a hospital. It was referred to as the workhouse or the poor farm. And they put out an ad looking for people to board, nurse, and care for the county poor. At that time, there was a group of nuns, the Sisters of Charity of Providence, that were active in the Pacific Northwest territories. And a group of 3 of them answered the call and showed up by a paddle boat from Vancouver, Washington. They're pictured up here, said to be stern French-Canadian nuns. And yeah, they assumed care of patients within the poorhouse, which you can see pictured here. They were not pleased with the farmhouse, and after a year, they actually moved locations and built another nice 3-story building, which became the first Providence Hospital in Seattle. That hung around for a couple of decades, and eventually that Providence Hospital moved to the Central District. And if you've ever driven by Swedish Cherry Hill, that really beautiful brick building is what used to be Providence Hospital. But with Seattle kind of expanding, lots of settlers moving in search of land or gold, these multiple hospitals just weren't enough. So in 1894 in the Georgetown district, a new brick King County hospital was built, and you can see that here. At the time with 100+ beds and an expansion in 1908 to 225 beds, but even so by the 1920s, became overcrowded, oftentimes with over 400 people, patients a day. So something new had to be built. That brings us to Harborview. In 1928, King County viewers approved a $2.75 million bond with the mission for a county hospital to care for the indigent, sick, injured, and maternity cases. The Seattle Times held a contest to see what it would be named, aside from King County Hospital, and one Miss Alva Patterson from Ballard won $100 for picking the name Harborview for its view of Elliott Bay from the west side of the building. Out of 7 potential sites, the First Hill site was chosen because at that time, First Hill was already a regional medical center. By the 1920s, Swedish, Virginia Mason, Cabrini were all hospitals that had already been in the area, so they decided to build another one there. And construction was done in a year, and in 1931, Harborview Hospital opened its doors with a capacity for over 500 patients. Also opening across the street, you can see a corner of it in this picture, is Harborview Hall, which was built to house nurses and nursing students that worked at Harborview. The University of Washington actually started its School of Nursing in 1922. And when Harborview opened, that became the primary site for its nurses and nursing students. It would be many years later until the School of Medicine would open. But soon after opening, the hospital kind of fell into similar problems. It was overcrowded, there was a lot of need for patients, and they had trouble staying in between. By 1939, the outpatient clinic was seeing over 500 patients a day, when really it only had the capacity to see about 100. And there were many calls for additional facilities that were initially rejected by voters. Albert D. Rossellini, who was the board chairman in the 1940s and would go on to be Washington governor, in one of his calls for funding said, and this will sound quite familiar, that, quote, the hospital load was 150% of capacity. Its rooms were so full that beds lined the corridor. But World War II happened, so expansions to hospitals took a back seat. And we'll kind of get back to that later. But in 1946, UW finally establishes its School of Medicine, and the first classes were taught on Harborview's campus, except there was no space in the building, so it was happening in Army surplus barracks behind the building called the Teaching Annex. And in the 60s, the UW assumes management of the hospital under contract with the county. A little bit of extra history. In the 1970s, 1969 is when the Medic One program first begins training firefighters to be rapid responders in response to cardiac events. For those of you who don't know, Medic One soon became nationally recognized because it had such good survival rates and such a good response. So it is a proud part of Harborview history. And here is the first Medic One ambulance, which I just love because it It's so goofy looking, but also very cute. And for the architecture buffs out there, to speak a little bit about the design of Harborview. It was built in the 1930s in an Art Deco style and was very acclaimed when it was opened. To toot our own horns a little bit, there are many glowing reviews written in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, Pacific Intelligencer rather, when it first opened its doors. Someone who reviewed the hospital called it modern in its every appointment, breathtaking in its uncanny utilization of space, and inspiring in its lack of institutional atmosphere. Total lack of institutional atmosphere. So they painted the walls inside not white, but various shades of pastels. And then here is a poster from the 1930s advertising Harborview on its hill and its mission of service. Apparently, the new hospital really glowed when you looked at it from Elliott Bay. And then features of its Art Deco design are its position on a prominent hill, its very vertical appearance, and its terracotta ornamentation. It's this like step pattern it has near the top with its giant center tower and pyramidal cap. And in 1933, kind of across the way, the US Marines Hospital, which is now PacMed, also opened its doors on another hill. And these two beautiful Art Deco buildings were the pride of Seattle in the 30s. To round out, for completionist's sake, the rest of Harborview, in the 50s, the South Wing, which is now East Clinic, was added. At the time, the international style was favorable, and that just means really horizontal, lots of glass, not very much ornamentation. In the 80s, the North Wing, which is now East Hospital, was completed, and that's brutalist, so kind of boring, nothing to look at. And in 98 is when the West Clinic and West Hospital were added, which doubled the capacity of the building, and that's kind of where most of our wards are. And that was done in a postmodern kind of take on the original Art Deco style. So again, there are this very, very vertical orientation, lots of fenestrations, terracotta-like ornamentation. Yeah, and just the other thing added in 98 was the garage for the Medic One ambulances with them sleeping quarters overhead. And they also tried to mimic that 1931 Art Deco style. So there's these concrete blocks that are made to look like stone, this chevron detailing and big metal gates with kind of this green roof on top meant to evoke the 1930s. So things you can check out the next time around. And finally, the Norm Malling building was added in 2008 along with that massive sky bridge. Alrighty. So the School of Medicine. The University of Washington was founded way back in 1861, and over many decades tried again and again to establish a School of Medicine, but was shot down sort of every time for various reasons. Proposals were made in 1884, 1895, and then 1916, but each time either the state legislature or the University Board of Directors shot it down. The Washington State Medical Association was also very opposed to the formation of the School of Medicine because they didn't want a sudden influx of doctors to be competitive. Just goes to show you can never trust these medical associations. But after World War I, there was World War II rather, there was such an influx of returning vets that needed care that they just simply needed more demand for physicians kind of across the United States. So in 1946, finally, this proposal was accepted, and in 47, the Health Sciences Building began construction. So the site that was chosen was this 40-acre university golf course, which you can see in this picture, that had been built by the Department of Engineering some years ago. That was sort of the only space that was left on the university campus with a lot of land. So you can see sort of early construction on the Health Sciences Building, and the parts of the golf course are still there. And then the university campus itself in the background. And in 1947, the first class of 50 medical students was admitted. Yes, lots of white men. Thankfully, there are a handful for women. And yes, it started originally its affiliation with Harborview, and then the other teaching hospitals at the time were actually the US Marines building, which is PACMed, and the Veterans Association. So those were the three main teaching hospitals when the School of Medicine first opened. The university hospital itself would not be built until 1959. And it was 8 stories tall with 291 beds. You can sort of see it coming up in this bottom left photo. And I've included some just cool pics of like the Montlake cut with like early versions of these buildings. And in the 1970s, given kind of an ongoing shortage of general practitioners in a lot of rural areas, the WAMI Consortium was founded, an agreement between the School of Medicine and Alaska, Montana, and Idaho to prioritize the training of primary care physicians that would return to their home states and serve their communities. 96 is when Wyoming joined. And over the course of the 70s, the school really expanded in size. The class went from about 100 to 180, and women from less than 10 members of the class to over 50. And there were lots of major expansions to the hospital in the 80s, 90s, thousands, and 2010s, which kind of resulted in it being the massive structure that it is today. Of note, the Magnuson Health Sciences Center, which is what it's called, is now over 20 wings interconnected by different hallways. And in terms of floor area, is one of the largest buildings in square foot in the US, behind a giant Tesla factory, the Palazzo, and the Pentagon. And now you know why it takes so long to get to the frickin' crow's nest, because this building was hobbled together over 40 years into this massive, massive structure. And to round us out, the VA, which I actually couldn't find much information about, but again, coming home from World War II, the Veterans Administration really didn't have the people power to take care of all these vets. So in 1946, passed the Policy and Association of Veterans Hospitals with Medical Schools. And that's what established the partnership between VAs and med schools that we kind of all are very familiar with now. And the VAs have kind of since become a very integral part of medical student training and residency. Adrian, good question. I think this was like a week before the doors opened. Don't know where that smoke is coming from. But there's building 1 back in 1951 when it first opened. So the city had deeded 44 acres of Jefferson Park as a site, and then the VA and the School of Medicine partnered to establish this Veterans Hospital. When it opened, you know, it was very, people celebrated its gorgeous views of the downtown, the Cascades and Mount Rainier, which for our benefit are still around for those working at the VA. And then in 1985, a major expansion added 515 beds, and that is building 100. All right. So, you know, I came across a lot of really cool pictures and a lot of quotes in putting this talk together. So I wanted to just end with some ones that kind of brought me a little bit of joy. Here is one from 1926, back when we still had the brick King County Hospital, just of the duties of an intern who admitted the majority of patients. Usually he had to go make home calls, ride in the ambulance, but sometimes patients brought directly to the hospital without previous notice. And an admitting intern is kept on call day and night for this purpose. So it's fun to see that things haven't changed all that much in 100 years. And then here is a letter from the 50s written by a student writing home to his family. He says, "I did it again. I flunked another test. I haven't been so mad at myself in years. Just don't have confidence and I blacked out. It makes me so mad I could almost cry. And cry is exactly what I feel like doing. I thought I really knew the contents and then I have to go and club it up. You'd better all start praying for me. Guess the only thing I can do is to study more, though I've been averaging 7 hours a night. Maybe I can get by with a little less sleep." So that was, you know, we've all been doing this for 50 years now. Yeah. So I've ended with a page of just lots of different sources and resources. Definitely feel free to reach out to me by email if you have any questions or wanted to kind of delve into some of what I went through. One of the websites I found that was really cool is actually historylink.org. It's basically like an encyclopedia of like Washington State history with a lot of primary sources, photos, like newspaper snippets. So it's just really cool if you're a history buff. I recommend checking it out. And yeah, we have some time for questions. So comments, so let me know if anyone has any thoughts.
Thanks, Michael. That was super interesting. Any last questions for any of our speakers today? Does the VA really have 800 beds? I do not know the answer to that question. Does anyone? Okay, well, we'll end a little bit early today, and please feel free to reach out if there's any questions again, and otherwise we will see you next Thursday for our next AHD. Thanks to all our speakers.